President, World Affairs Council. Our program today is with Fred Hochberg, who's the author of Trade is Not a Four-Letter Word. This program today is being brought to you in part, I must underline, by the UPS Foundation and the Atlanta Global Studies Center. I want to welcome, we've got a bunch of Robinson College Business faculty on this call and students. We had originally planned to bring Fred to Atlanta, I think it was April 27th, if I'm not, or 20th, that we were going to bring you to Atlanta, and of course all that got shut down, and so we regrouped and we've got Fred live from Miami Beach, which we can see out his back window there. And so delighted to do this. Before we go any further, if you have questions that you want to ask Fred, please send them to me using the Zoom chat function. At the bottom of your screen, it says chat. Click on that, send it to me, Charles Shapiro. I will edit out all the four-letter words. Any of you are angry at me or Clyde or Craig or Fred.
Wait, the book is about four-letter words.
Well, you said it's not a four-letter word, so it's not a four-letter word. Let me get this straight. And then I'll send those on to Craig, so Craig can ask the questions from you in about a half an hour. So Clyde Tuggle, who's a founding board member of the World Affairs Council, still on our board, was a chair at one time, founding partner of Pine Island Investments, is a friend of Fred and wants to introduce him. So over to you, Clyde.
Yeah, and also I want to say a couple words about our moderator, Craig Lesser. First, what I'd say is, Fred, welcome. It's great to have you here. Fred and I had lunch months ago, and we were talking about his book, and I said to him, look, there's this wonderful organization in Atlanta, the World Affairs Council, and this is right up our alley. And so who would have known that we'd be doing it under these circumstances? But Fred, welcome, and thank you for your time today. And then Craig, thank you for moderating this. We have really two people who know as much about trade as anybody I know. And I get asked the question of folks, why is trade important? And I say to people, well, from the minute you get up in the morning until you go to bed at night, you are either the beneficiary or the victim of good and bad trade decisions. But the world as we know it doesn't work without it. By way of quick introduction of you, Craig and I have known each other for many years. Craig was the Georgia's Commissioner of Economic Development and Trade from 2004 to 7. He and I had the privilege of traveling around the world with then Governor Perdue on a number of missions that Coca-Cola had mutual interests with the state of Georgia. He had a storied career with Southern Company doing all sorts of interesting things, both on the operational side and on the public affairs side. He was also connected at one point with McKenna, Long and Aldridge, and now is the managing partner of the Pendleton Group, which does all sorts of good work in the government affairs space and in economic development and strategic communications. So Craig, thank you for managing the conversation today. And then just a couple of words about my good friend, Fred Hochberg. Look, it's a great story. His family story, many of you may know. His mother was Lillian Vernon, and one of the great entrepreneurial stories, built this wonderful business really out of a garage. And it was Fred who came in and turned this family-owned mail order company into an international, publicly traded company. And Forbes at one point, I think, if I got this correct, Fred, described the company's growth as one of the great stories of American entrepreneurship. But in addition to a great successful business career, Fred has been an extraordinary public servant, serving in a number of roles in terms of the Small Business Association, and was on Clinton's Management Council. Most importantly, was Obama's chairman and president of the Export-Import Bank of the U.S. And I would also add that Fred has been a moving force in the LGBT community, really paving the way for a number of important really changes that have occurred both in the private and the public sector. And he and his partner, Tom Healy, who's a wonderful writer, reside in Miami Beach. And so, Fred, it's great to have you here today. And with that, over to you, Craig and Fred. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Clyde. And you're way, way too kind in your introduction of me. And I appreciate that very much. And I appreciate our friendship. I also appreciate.
He's not too kind about his introduction to me, though. That was perfectly pitch perfect.
I wasn't going to go there. And I want to thank Charles for giving me this opportunity. These are big shoes to fill to moderate a discussion. Charles does a superb job. I guess now virtually every day doing these webinars for the World Affairs Council, and it's a great honor to fill in and give him a break for just a half an hour or so. So with that, we'll get on with it. Fred, it's so good to see you again today. I'm in Nashville, so I would say good morning, but for most of you, it's good afternoon. And let's get right to it. Trade is it's not a four-letter word. What on earth does that mean, and what's the premise of the book?
I want to take one little detour to Clyde's comments. Two things. One, the Lillian Vernon catalog was actually for many, many years printed in Atlanta, Georgia, in Doraville was our printer, a company called Foot and Davies, and there was another company called World Color. So I spent many weekends. Usually you do press okays at 2 and 3 in the morning, proofreading our catalog to make sure it got out on time. So I spent a lot of time in Atlanta and think fondly of it. And the only other thing I would add is, when Clyde mentioned the business was started in a garage, I did learn men start businesses in garages, women start them on kitchen tables. And in fact, the kitchen table that my mother did start the business on is actually right now sitting at the Smithsonian Museum in Washington and going on exhibit sometime in the next 6 to 12 months on entrepreneurship. So, but I did sort of discover that men start them in garages, women start them on the kitchen table. But I'll move on to trade. So Craig, thank you, and Clyde and Charles, thank you for inviting me here today. And this is going to be the new normal, I think, for quite some time. I got the idea for this book. I was fortunate to be named by President Obama as chairman of the Export-Import Bank. And the Export-Import Bank, briefly, is an entity started by FDR, 1934, whereby he realized to support jobs, we need companies to export. Why don't they export more? Sometimes it's financing, sometimes it's the fear of their bankers, or just the idea of doing a transaction overseas. That was important in 1934, and I would say that's going to be important as we come out of this COVID-19 crisis. We're going to need to support more jobs, and part of that is about exports. I did notice over that period of time that trade just got to be considered conflated with outsourcing, with low-cost goods coming into the United States, and somehow became something bad, as opposed to a force for good, as opposed to a driver of American jobs, and also of trying to bring so many people in the world out of poverty. It did exacerbate and make worse a number of the inequities in our society. And we've seen that, and in certain communities really got badly hollowed out. A lot of the Midwest around Wisconsin, Michigan, and so forth. So from that, I wanted to sort of set the record straight. I wanted to sort of have people who read the book, and I hope all of you will read this book. I'll just do a little bit of promotion right here. To get a more balanced understanding of trade and how it impacts your lives, and frankly, how we have a far less interesting and a far more costly life without it.
So this is important given the situation we're in now. When did you finish writing the book?
So I worked on the, I worked on the book for a long time. I had two fellowships, one at the University of Chicago and one at the Kennedy School at Harvard. So I would say I probably researched it well over a year, collecting stories, meeting people, and of course, my time at the Export-Import Bank, traveling around the country. I had no idea of writing. I never thought I'd write a book in 100 years. So the actual writing was probably, bulk of it was over a 6-month period, December through like April, May of December of, where are we? 18 through April, May of 19.
And I ask that because we're going to talk about the book, but what's changed? We're also going to, I also want to get from you what's different today than when you
Right.
finished the book.
Right. Well, I think what's different today, and one of the main things, Craig, is that one, it's in, Donald Trump, in my acknowledgments in the book, which I took a lot of liberties with, it's about 4 pages, but the last acknowledgement, actually I will, just let me pull it out because, so I get it right. So one of the acknowledgments in the book is, and to President Donald Trump, perhaps unlikely source, move the conversation around tariffs and trade from the back page of the business section to page A1 of our newspapers. So for one, what's happened is, and President Trump has sort of made trade far more central to his administration, to his understanding of America's place in the world. When President Obama was in office, for example, working with China as a good example, we had issues around, yes, trade, currency, North Korea, terrorism, the oil embargo with Iran, the South China Sea, climate, human rights, Hong Kong, Taiwan. We had many issues. Donald Trump sort of collapses all of those. There's only one thing that's important, and that's the trade deficit with China. And if he's been, so I think that has pushed trade to kind of the center of our thinking on a lot of things, and in particular with China. And I think that's actually a mistake.
So let's get back to basics. Trade is not a 4-letter word. It's a 5-letter word. What did you mean by that?
Well, I meant is it's a good thing. It has often been blamed, and frankly, on both parties. Senator Sanders and Senator Warren feel that trade is the ruination of the American worker, has degraded all salaries, has caused great inequality, and is one of the worst things that's happened to America in the last 20, 25 years. So, and I'm trying to say, actually, from the cars we drive to the foods we eat, to the education, and Craig, you and I briefly talked about this, the amount of foreign students who study in our country, bringing a diversity to the classroom, and also, frankly, keeping many universities and colleges solvent. These are many of the benefits of trade. People get to sample and understand American life through trade. So I'm trying to say trade is a force for good. There are certainly bad things that trade has done. It has certainly hollowed out some communities. We haven't done a good job as a country in recognizing the losers, people who lost out, and how do we help them make sure they get back on their feet and support them.
When we often think about trade, we think about goods being sold from the United States to other countries. But that's not the whole story, is it?
Right. I mean, right here in Atlanta, we have Delta Airlines. That is a lot of trade in terms of tourism. Tourism is a major force of growth. And in fact, just to touch on China for a minute, Chinese tourists spend about double what other tourists spend when they did come to America. Spend about $34 billion in travel to America, which includes everything from the hotels they go to, airline tickets, theater, dinners, shopping. So one of the things I talk about in the book, I have a chapter on education, higher ed being a service export. People come to America and they buy educational services. So they're buying it, that's an export. Tourists come to America, they buy a travel experience, whether it's going to Disney World in Orlando, which is the most visited tourist spot in the United States, to going to Broadway or going to Chicago and coming to visit the South. And also entertainment, Game of Thrones. That television program, that series would not be possible without trade in terms of the kind of people, actors, technicians, musicians, cameramen, and where it was shot without trade. And we export close to $200 billion worth of entertainment a year, more than we do in aerospace. It may explain, Craig, why some of the movies that come out, you and I don't enjoy that much, because we're not the audience anymore. The audience is in China. The audience is in Indonesia. It's in Africa. It's in India. that's also the audience. So when they're making a movie, they're not only thinking about 330 million Americans.
So one of the things, and I was as guilty of this as anybody in the economic development field when I was commissioner, we tend to think, we have to think about trade and foreign direct investment as the whole package of global economy. And we emphasize, as government officials, particularly elected officials, we tend to emphasize those opportunities where we can have a photo op and cut a ribbon on a new factory. But it's difficult to elaborate and take a lot of credit for trade, yet trade leads to foreign direct investment. Why don't we spend more time and emphasis and investment in advancing trade?
Well, I think partly we sort of feel it's up to, we leave businesses on their own. You know, one of the comments I thought about when I chaired the Export Import Bank is that, you know, the best we do for American export is give them a pat on the back. You know, the rest of the world gives them a giant bear hug and treats them very specially. Siemens, for example, in Germany, is a crown jewel. Airbus is considered to be a crown jewel of both France, Germany, and Britain. They see these industrial companies, Alstom in France, as being vital to their national heritage, to their legacy, and to their economic well-being. We don't really take the same. We're much more hands-off. We believe that business should succeed on its own, which I agree with, but we have to understand when our companies go out to compete around the rest of the world, that isn't the way the rest of the world looks at it. They much more have the state governments behind them in a much more aggressive and assertive way.
Talk a little bit about NAFTA and the new trade agreement and what impact both have had on trade and why so many people seem to have thought that NAFTA was so bad for our country.
So NAFTA, just for everybody, obviously the North American Free Trade Agreement, and has been renamed the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement. And by the way, the name, in talking to the Mexican ambassador, is not just to get the word free trade out. It's to make clear it's about United States, Mexico, and Canada. So it was done, actually, it was started by Ronald Reagan, who was worried about the EU and seeing the EU as being a competitive force that would be very hard for the United States to be a counterweight to, because you'd have close to 500 million people in Europe banding together, trading amongst themselves, and becoming a giant economic and trading bloc. So actually the idea was started by Ronald Reagan, negotiated and signed by George W. Bush, H.W. Bush, and then it was left to Bill Clinton, who actually had to get it through Congress. Though many people seem to see this as Bill Clinton's NAFTA, as opposed to linking it both to George H.W. Bush and Ronald Reagan. It formed a way that our economies were stitched together and that trade moved freely between us, between the three countries. Trade was already, we already had an agreement with Canada, and the idea was to stitch the three together. I think part of the reason it's gotten a bad taste in people's mouth also has to do with the fact that the places that really took it on the chin, that really had a hard time with NAFTA, were some of the Midwestern industrial states. Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan. Coincidentally or not, they tend to be 4 battleground states every 4 years. So it should not surprise us why trade and why that agreement, beyond so many other things we've done in this country, has been such a challenging issue for us. If I make an analogy, I'm doing this broadcast today, or this talk today, from Miami Beach. We have a large Cuban population. Florida happens to be a battleground state. It is why our Cuba policy has very much been held, quote unquote, hostage, I would say, to the fact that this is a battleground state, and how Cubans vote will be very much an influence of how this state goes in presidential elections. So in a similar way, those Midwestern states, trade has become a very electrifying issue as a result. I would say today, though, Craig, the most judgment is that it really is technology. It really is the automation we're seeing in factories. And the fact I talked about in the book, you and I can remember when you bought a car, you hoped beyond hope you didn't get a lemon, you know, a car that just didn't work. Well, frankly, the automation has so improved manufacturing process, there are no lemons. So if you get rid of 2 or 3 or 4% defects, all of a sudden your productivity increases enormously just from that fact alone.
So interestingly, both of these North American agreements have the word trade in them, not foreign direct investment, but trade. I hope there's bourbon in there.
It's just lemon. It's too early for bourbon.
It depends. It's after 5 somewhere.
That's true.
Um,
Well, yes, you know, Penny Pritzker, as Secretary of Commerce, really championed this thing called Select USA. And it was the first time ever as a country, we actually had a national program to attract investment into the United States. Craig, as you know, state after state has an economic development office. Many states have overseas offices to encourage foreign direct investment. Nikki Haley brought a lot of investment into South Carolina, particularly the auto field. But we have never really marketed our country. And I agree with you entirely. It has been to our detriment. This is a very good place to do business. We have good rule of law. When you and I are probably not thrilled with our infrastructure, it's better than many places in the world. We have a skilled workforce. So we should be doing a hell of a lot more in FDI and foreign direct investment, and this is a good platform to export, frankly, from the US to Canada, Central and Latin America.
you talk about Miami, you talk about some of these states that are in the midst of both the political and economic conflict. You're in Florida, I'm in Tennessee right now, but most of our audience, if not all, happen to be in the state of Georgia, where we are most proud of the Georgia ports. We're most proud of Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. We're most proud of our higher education, which competes with any state or country. Give us a perspective on what you think the future of trade is for a state like Georgia.
Well, you know, I had a fair amount of experience with Georgia as chairman of Export-Import Bank. Our largest client in the state, largest exporter we worked with, Gulfstream, down near Savannah. And frankly, Gulfstream is a good example to understand. They are competing against primarily Canada and France in terms of the sale of business jets. And we finance a lot of Gulfstream jets to China, which is a growing and burgeoning market. And my hunch would be, in the wake of COVID-19, there may be a bigger push towards business jets than they may have been even before because of just health and safety concerns. So that's been, we also worked with at the other end of the spectrum, a company called Thrush in Albany, Georgia, that makes crop dusters. And they were also a large exporter to China and Asia. And believe it or not, they would fly these planes. How they delivered them, they would fly them across the United States, up to Alaska, across Alaska, and then down to China. It made many stops, but that's how they actually delivered those crop duster planes that we financed as well. And we also finance companies like Delta Tech Ops. You know, Delta, we think of Delta and Hartsfield Airport, but Delta has a large business in providing technical services to airlines in Mexico and in Brazil and the rest of Latin America. So Georgia, I think, has that. And part of what I talk about in the book, and I know we have Lee Zach right on this call today, on this program today, that a higher education is a huge export and an important export between Georgia Tech, Emory, and many other schools within the state. This is something that I also wish, when you say we don't talk enough about foreign direct investment, we should be doing much more state by state to encourage foreign students to come and study in those states. They bring a diversity and a perspective in the classroom, and frankly, they also pay full tuition.
I have a million more questions, but I also want to encourage people who are watching us today and listening to you intently, Fred, to ask your question, which you know you can do in the chat room. But I'm going to go right to one or two right away. From Jacobus Bohr's, free trade appears to be in retreat. Is this an anomaly or a long-term trend?
I don't think this has been brewing for quite some time, because I think the issues of trade cut against our sense of identity, our sense of national pride. And certainly this crisis has made many people, we've often talked about national security. And then in the last, I would say 5-10 years, we hear people talk about food security, water security, energy security. I think we're going to be hearing a little bit more about health security in terms of, do we have reliable supply chains of personal protective gear, PPE we hear a lot about, or medicines and so forth. So I think there is going to be, I would say, I don't know about a retreat, but it may be a slight rebalancing, that in certain areas, just like, let's remember, it was the energy and oil crisis of the 70s that actually brought in two trends in America. One, a push on renewable energy, and two, finding energy sources in the United States, which ultimately 30 years later led to things like fracking and so forth. So I believe there's going to be a lot of innovation that's going to come out of this, and we're going to rethink our trade as well.
So thank you for that. You referenced the supply chain issues. How do you see things coming out of this in a little bit more detail, changing as it relates to supply chain? I mean, we have relied so much, as you pointed out, on China. How much is that going to change now?
Well, I think what companies are realizing is that to rely on one supplier in one country is probably doesn't provide enough resilience to your supply chain. So I think that they are looking at diversifying that, and it may be including Taiwan, Malaysia, India, Indonesia, other places around the world, Mexico, as opposed to one. The analogy I make, Craig, if you're used to taking mass transit to go to work every day, and as a result of this COVID crisis, you say, well, maybe I don't want to get on the MART in Atlanta, or I don't want to get on a public bus. So do I ride share? Do I drive with a neighbor? Do I start driving myself? We have to find alternative ways to get to work. I think in the similar way of supply chain, we're going to need to find alternate ways that if there's a problem, and it could be a natural disaster. In my book, I mentioned during Fukushima, oddly, the company that supplies the black metallic paint used in most automobiles came from a small factory right near Fukushima. And after that disaster, there was no black paint to be found for quite some time. The world survived, and cars were still made without black paint. But the point was, all of that was reliant on one area of the world and one company. So I think that on more vital goods, we're going to need to diversify. If we look at our food supply chain, when we have a shortage, we're talking about a potential shortage of beef and pork in this country. The fact that we import a lot of beef and pork from New Zealand, from Australia, actually keeps the supply going if we have a temporary interruption here. It's one of the benefits of trade that we never talk about, but it's clearly evident.
But don't you think in terms of needing particular goods, maybe not services, but certainly goods, until some inequities in work compensation, in other words, it costs $30 an hour to pay somebody to do something here. It costs in China $1.50 an hour. That's still going to be a bottom line that we have to deal with.
Right. We do have to deal with it. I think we also have to recognize, and we haven't fully absorbed this yet, we are really a service economy. When we've talked about the loss of steel jobs, President Trump made a large ado about the loss of steel jobs or coal jobs. More people lost their jobs in retail in 2017 than the entire coal industry and steel industry employ combined. But the difference is many of those people who lost those jobs were women, Many of those people were people of color, and therefore we didn't focus on them in the same way. So I think what we should be realizing with this crisis right now and the incoming automation, artificial intelligence, we need to prepare people to have a sense of lifelong readiness, that your job, your career is going to change many ways over the course of your career. And we need to be more prepared for that. And we ourselves, I think, need to be more resilient, because we're not going to be able to go back to the same job. I was talking to a woman I've worked with for many years, a travel agent, and she started her business when it was a pioneer, on trips to Asia for American companies. And she's basically had to shut down. She said, there is no international travel. There's none until next year. She's a good friend. I've known her for over 25 years, but I'm thinking she has to kind of rethink that whole business and what her career is going to be. And I think all of us have to be, and we have to be talking to people we work with, talking to family members about being a little more resilient, thinking about our own resilience in a certain way.
And we do that when we are forced to think about that. But you raised the point a moment ago about preparing young people for what their career opportunities are going to be over a full lifetime, which is, Fred, I dare say, another program or 2 or 3 programs that we might have on how we're dealing with the education system. We have another question, this time from Trevor Williams. How would you help the losers more effectively? Worker retraining, continuing education. This gets back to your point a moment ago. How do you retrain a middle-aged worker for the new economy?
It's tough. First of all, I think we got to get rid of the word lifelong learning, because for 70% of Americans have a high school degree. They do not have a college degree. The happiest day of the year is coming up right now when they graduate high school. And to say, oh, you have lifelong learning, go back to the classroom. It's like telling you or me, Craig, I believe, you know what, I'd like you to go learn German or Vietnamese for a year. And I would think, is there an alternative to that? I would do anything not to have to sit in the classroom and have to learn a foreign language at this point. So partly it's lifelong readiness. 1, being alert to the fact you're going to have to change. 2, there are a few examples I cite in the book. Guy named Rusty Justice, a great name in Kentucky. He was a coal miner, and he realized that was not a path to a lifelong income and career. He learned how to code. He formed a company that does coding, and he's employed many people in that field, many people in Kentucky who are doing coding. Governor Raimondo in Rhode Island has had programs, frankly, starting in elementary school all the way through high school on computer skills. She's going to make sure the kids learns coding, and it becomes just part and parcel of their education. It is, to answer the question, it is certainly more challenging for people who are 40 and 50. But part of that, it also has to be up here. We have to have some personal responsibility and find ways to take advantage of programs that are out there. And there are programs. They're not easy. It's not for everybody. Some will work in cities. Some are going to work in more rural communities. But I understand fully the pain of having had a job for 20 or 30 years, and now it has to change, is difficult.
Well, this is a really good segue to a question that comes in from someone named Charles Shapiro. Why are so many SMEs hesitant to look for international markets and customers? XM helps, but what else can we do as a nation? And this is a problem I experienced here in the state of Georgia. And part of it, if I may, just before you jump in, is that so many of these smaller entrepreneurs and business people, they're running their businesses 7 days a week. They just think international trade is something that's way beyond what they can comprehend, and that the regulatory process is going to be limiting. Fred?
Right. Well, I tell you one thing, from my experience at Export Bank, and obviously I'm already dealing with exporters, but what to my surprise was, when I was in business, we looked to maximize the domestic market, as you said, working 7 days a week. And when we exhausted that, looked to go abroad. It's like years ago, if you had a restaurant, you would grow, you'd grow it like crazy and try and do the best you can. Today, if someone starts a restaurant, they're already thinking about how do I replicate this? How do I actually not have one restaurant, but how do I do it across the city, across the state, across the region? So I do think that people I talk to today starting businesses have international business, exporting, and a more global perspective almost on day one. They don't see it as, I'm going to have a US company. I think that one of the things, that's what obviously the Export-Import Bank was put in place to do. You know, I mentioned some of the big companies. I looked up in Georgia, our smallest company, we did a transaction worth $350. $350 worth of exports. So I think partly people, when they hear a federal government, the Export-Import Bank or something like that, they think of very large transactions, not small ones. I do support what President Obama did. In his first year, he said we ought to double exports in 5 years. It was kind of, and it has a great impact. It said to governors and mayors and county executives, we need to be looking at how do we support, as you were saying, those companies in our city to start exporting around the world. We didn't double exports everywhere in the world, but you know, we did in a lot of countries. And those we didn't double, they went up 50%, 75%. We actually moved manufactured goods, product exports to the highest level they've been ever before.
We have time for one more question for Fred. This is from Kamisha Glasgow. How much has cultural tension with immigrants fueled an anti-trade sentiment in your view?
Oh, I think it has a lot to do with it. I think that immigration in our country, from what I've seen, is close to 15%, which it was at the turn of the 20th century, and provoked a lot of backlash. I think many of us, we walk down the street, if I'm in New York City and I hear 2 or 3 different languages, I think that's a spectacular aspect of America, that we are able to attract, and people can come to this country, and after being here a number of years, they're an American. If Craig, if you and I go to any other country, we could live there for 30 years, we'll never be French, we'll never be German, no matter how long we're there. But I think that for many people, that has been a threat. They have seen that as a depression on wages. They have seen that in a way that it has sort of diluted, in their view, what it means to be American. And I think that it certainly is a factor. But, you know, it's a factor. It's also a factor that more people of color in the workplace. There's also a factor that more women in the workplace. You know, this is a little controversial. White high school educated men had a monopoly in the workplace for many, many years, in manufacturing, in construction, in pilots and services in the airline industry. And we all know monopolies don't like to give up power very easily or joyfully. So it should not surprise us that these tensions are here.
We have to turn this over to Charles to close us out to maintain our time, but I want to ask you to close out. We have many, many students on this teleconference today, on this webinar. Words for those students today, Fred, as it relates to trade, and maybe even beyond that.
Well, one, I hope to come back to Atlanta sometime and meet the students face to face. That would be always exciting. I would say for students, back to one of the comments I made earlier, it's about partly being lifelong ready, and that is particularly today. This is going to be a hard time to graduate, a hard time to enter the workforce, but thinking about making sure that you're constantly learning and picking up new skills. And frankly, if you're in college, you're already sort of predestined for that, because frankly, people who go to college have already exhibited some idea about wanting to learn more. So I think you have to keep learning. That's the only way you're going to find a full and rich life, and also a successful life, I believe, is by doing that.
Fred Hochberg, what a great guest. Thank you so much for joining us today. Trade is not a 4-letter word. Go out and buy the book. There you go. Thank you so much for being our guest today. Clyde, thank you so much for bringing Fred to us in your kind introduction. And Charles, I know you're eager to get back in the driver's seat, but thank you for giving me this great honor today. It's all yours.
had to unmute myself. Thanks, Craig. This has been great. You make a better me than I do. So I appreciate it. The little known fact about Craig Lesser is that he used to be a radio talk show host. And if you think about it, you can hear it in his voice and you can hear it.
Absolutely.
And so, Craig, I want to thank you so much. Fred, this has been terrific. We tried to get you to Atlanta, so we had to bring you here virtually, and we hope to get you back to Atlanta once we go back to normal activities. Fred, this has been terrific. Enjoyed it thoroughly. I have to tell you, I teach a class at the Robinson College of Business on global markets and encouraging, these are executive MBA students, to look abroad, that their companies can find markets abroad. And that is, it's like a mental barrier more than anything else for people to actually think and sort of open that window. And you've helped do that today. So I appreciate this tremendously. Here's the advertisement for the World Affairs Council, y'all. We've got on Friday, we've got a program on mastering leadership in times of crisis. It's going to be an hour-long interactive conversation with Dorier Underwood Consulting. It's for members only. Join the World Affairs Council and register for this. It's going to be terrific. Next week, we have 3 fabulous speakers. On Tuesday, Jim Reed, who's the president of YKK Corporation of America. Nobody knows what YKK is, but look at the little tab on your zipper and you will see that we all use YKK products. They're fabulous and have a great manufacturing plant in Macon, Georgia. On Wednesday, we're going to talk with Arlette Guthrie, who's a board member of ours and the VP of Human Resources at the Home Depot, talking about skills for the future to build on what we've been talking about today. And then on Thursday of next week, we have Stacey Abrams, who's going to talk about her international view, her view for the world. So please join us next week. Join the World Affairs Council. Love for you to make a donation to the World Affairs Council. Love for you to sponsor a program. I can't think of a better present for a graduating high school or college student than give them a membership or make a contribution in their honor. Fred, once again, thank you. This has been great. I appreciate you taking the time to do this. Craig, thank you again for moderating. Clyde, thanks for doing the intros. That's been terrific. And I'll see y'all on Friday. Okay, great. Thank you.
Great.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.